Big claims. Well, guess what? That particular former CIA officer was lying for years about working for the spy agency.
I imagine he said, I was under such cover that they're going to disown me. So if you ask the CIA if I really worked there, no, they're going to say, I've never heard of him, never heard of him. That's how secret my mission was, I mean, gullibility.
In Texas, a man who claimed to be a spy and a war hero, a man who traveled under several aliases.
He's got a certain glow about him that's not your typical everyday person.
Maybe the most dangerous man I ever met.
Living in a house full of weapons, but this time he wasn't in Texas. He was in the heart of a terrified British community.
He is deranged, he must be. He's frightening.
He was potentially, a madman. He really was.
A man who was suspected of being a murderer, but whose skill for fantasy stories and multiple lives is a man who shows a talent for grand deception, and the residents of Barton are only the latest in a long line to fall for lies that date back to Texas. The local community were impressed by the newcomer, who seemed to be a genuine all-American hero, telling his own wild stories.
He always claimed to have been a CIA operative.
He was also in the French Foreign Legion.
In addition to claiming he had 2 or 3 PhDs, he spoke a half a dozen languages fluently.
He claimed to be part of the operation in the Bay of Pigs.
He claimed to have been responsible for the assassination of Che Guevara.
He also claimed to have gotten court-martialed for flying under bridges.
He was very good at convincing people about anything. And he would tell stories where you really, couldn't follow up or track it, or you really didn't even feel like you needed to.
He was an avid hunter, and he joined local church groups, becoming a baptized Mormon. But it wasn't long before cracks began to appear in the new arrival's story.
And he just went into an absolute rage. So I witnessed how he would go from quiet to just leaping up, and with his fist clenched and just screaming and hollering and cursing.
The Mormons were becoming suspicious of a man who claimed to be a spy and secret agent, but few could have guessed the real truth. Far from being a war hero, a compulsive hoarder of firearms was actually a former mental patient on the run from the police.
His conflict resolution method is to be violent or to threaten violence. He's in love with guns. He is just infatuated with guns.
The gun became an extension of himself and gave him power. And guns have an effect on certain psyches like that. It's a part of their body because it gives them lethal force. And they don't have to take no crap off of nobody.
He began to write a series of threatening letters to the local bishop.
There was a lot of things in the letters about being CIA, Big Brother was watching you.
I gave up everything I owned and was chased, hounded, tracked down, jailed, starved, and insulted, not only by my enemies, but by the church itself.
When I got through reading those letters, I knew we had a problem when I got it.
I do not want a pat on the head or a paw shake. I want blood. I want to go after my false accusers now and bring them to dishonor.
The police were baffled by their suspect, a man who had a host of aliases and more than one personality.
A personality that he had who was supposed to be an ex-CIA agent who had been discredited during the Nixon era, and the CIA had tried to kill him.
He apparently was acting pretty strangely enough that the officers started to wonder just what they were dealing with, that there may be a mental health question here.
And right before our eyes, you could see this guy change.
And he had set up kind of a personal shooting gallery behind his trailer. And he would frequently shoot the target and then send his guests down to fetch the target and return for them to examine it and see how many bullseyes he had.
And in it he described in detail his habits of killing, dissecting, and disposing of animal carcasses.
Leave no evidence such as guts behind. My eternal life is on the line this fight, and I do not intend to lose this fight.
The content of those letters and some of the other stuff that he left seems to have removed any doubt. He pen-palled with a lot of women. He joined these pen pal clubs. They'd give him a list of people who wanted to pen pal, and he'd write his CIA stories and war hero stories, and gee, I got all these degrees.
In the northeast of England, a policeman's widow was beginning a correspondence she would come to regret.
He wrote saying that he was in fact a college professor come to bring wisdom and enlightenment.
But what he did was he got her to disclose more and more of her personal circumstances, so that he eventually discovered, for instance, that she owned the house that she lived in. She had very modest financial reserves, but she did have some.
But while he had managed to keep his true identity secret from his pen pal, he was on his way to England.
If some character like this who is a United States citizen decides that they are going to leave the United States and go to another country, apparently we don't necessarily have an obligation to advise other people of that. And if you get your passport back, you can go anywhere where the people will let you in.
And suddenly there are boxes arriving. And I don't just mean the odd one, I mean dozens of them, full of the most incredible rubbish, up to and including, I seem to remember, tins of macaroni. And she didn't know what to think of this, and this old world, charming, pleasant man arrived, very helpful, very respectful, was absolutely as nice as he possibly could be to her.
4 months after his arrival, Marie Longley was married to a man she thought was a former CIA agent and war hero. It was the first in a new set of fantasies that would take in not just Marie, but the whole community.
It wasn't long before he was showing us his Congressional Medal Award, presented to him by President Eisenhower.
He said he'd got Purple Heart.
I won that, he said, by doing sorties over 3 or 4 days in Korea, dropping napalm in John Pass or something like that.
I forget how many MiGs he thought he'd shot down, but it grows with every time he tells it.
We'd shot down 31 MiGs, I think it was.
He'd shot 34 MiGs down.
He'd worked for the CIA.
He was an assassin.
He was a U-2 pilot.
I had no reason to doubt him because he was a lot older than me.
I think I give him the benefit of the doubt, just like everybody else.
I was impressed with his stories because it was just, you could make a film of it and put it on the telly and you could have a serial.
He was already moving himself closer to the kind of hunting and gun community he had lived within in Texas. It wasn't quite big game, but the local duck and wildfowlers eventually allowed him to join. Then the former mental patient applied for a British gun license.
You have to have a very good reason for either refusing or revoking someone's certificate, and essentially have to show that a person is a danger to public safety or to the peace. At that particular time, for foreign nationals, it was not usual, unless there was a very good reason, to go check-in back in the country where they were born, where they'd lived.
Receiving a gun license marked a change in his behaviour. Marie Longley's listed cottage was overrun as his gun obsession took over.
He had his bedroom taken over by loading machines for ammunition and stacks of ammunition.
Patterns of behaviour from Texas were repeated as he began to intimidate his wife with his weapons.
And eventually she realised that he was actually a very disturbed man that she lumbered herself with. And Marie's rather old-fashioned. She believes that if you make a mistake, you have to live with the consequences. And that's what she did.
Concealing his past, he was now a local gun expert, swapping Christmas cards with the police and advising them on ammunition. But according to her friends, Marie Longley's life was about to reach a new low ebb.
And he made her ring up people and make excuses so that they wouldn't come to the house. She really had something like 5 years living in that little room.
People usually liked him to start off with. On the first few stories that they heard, it was a case of, an interesting bloke. But then the more and more stories, it's sort of like, well, is this interesting or is it just bullshit?
Fellow members soon became suspicious of his eccentricities.
When he's friendly with you, he's nice. It's only when you cross him, like you sell him a gun and he doesn't pay you and you want your money, then he'll rear up. He's quite horrible then.
He had a temper. It flared up so quickly. You'd see a change in his features and his eyes, and all of a sudden he could be like a wild man. His face, the way it distorted, and then he would approach you into your domain and push himself at you.
But no one in the police checked with the American authorities to see exactly who the elusive American in their midst was. The gun clubs themselves were now looking for any reason they could to expel the Mad Yank.
They said, in effect, that he was a fraud and that he wasn't a recipient of a medal.
Had lied about his military honours, Fox asked him to leave his gun club and received a death threat in return. Finally, with this information provided by an amateur sleuth, the police began doing their own investigation.
After a while, the inquiry came back, and I have to say I was quite shocked when I saw these convictions.
And had a history of firearms offences. The police moved in, raiding the cottage and confiscating his guns.
He was just a blubbering wreck. A totally blubbering wreck. He sat down in the chair and he cried, I would say, for about 5 hours non-stop. And he would say, they've taken my children away, they've taken my children away. And they were his children to him. That was the sort of depth of his mental confusion, I suppose.
His guns had been taken, but his wife remained. As in Texas in 1974, everyone around him felt threatened by his presence.
He'd have a coffee table, and to the leg next to him was a knife strapped to him. He had a hit list. He had a list of people's names who was on that list that he was going to do things to them.
Again, they raided the cottage and found 2 more illegally held pistols. One, an assassin's pistol, complete with silencer.
This is what he claimed in interview had been his own personal issue weapon when he'd worked for the CIA. It was part of his fantasy, if he genuinely believed that was his weapon in the CIA and that he used it to assassinate people.
In America, he was described as an extremely dangerous man who would constitute a threat to society if ever released.
But a fascination with violent weapons proved his downfall again.
And this should have been the last chapter in his bizarre life in Britain.
He'd been let out on bail. He threatened to kill me and his wife. I was concerned, quite annoyed at the judiciary that let out a psychotic on bail, frankly.
The magistrates paroled him out back home, but it wasn't his home.
He had to report to the police station every day.
It was the house that Mary had run away from, and it was hers. And she daren't go back.
As soon as he was released, was writing to pen pals again, had no intention of returning to court, and was planning to relocate to the continent.
It was so predictable. It was like the sun coming up tomorrow. You knew he was going to do it because he always did this. He always ran away at that particular point.
With a German woman who would become his 5th wife, and a van full of Marie Longley's furniture.
We placed him under surveillance because we were becoming even more concerned that he was going to skip the country.
After suffering suspected heart failure,
He was certainly not of stable mind. Not only was an embellisher of facts, he was potentially, a madman. He really was.
Very crafty man. Very crafty.
Very evilly crafty.
Evilly crafty.
Oh, and frightening. Oh.